10 years had passed since the sealing of the zombies and the awakening of the ancient Ark ship. Kevin stood in the central research facility, looking at the massive database that contained everything known about Karath's history and the plague that had nearly destroyed the Varathian civilization. His work had evolved far beyond what he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a veterinarian or a researcher. He had become something else entirely, a bridge between human and Varathian understanding, a keeper of history and a voice that helped explain the lessons of the past to both species. The city that had grown up on Karath was now home to more than 50,000 people. Human buildings mixed seamlessly with Varathian structures in an architecture that had been developed through years of collaboration between engineers from both species. The streets were wide and clean, designed to accommodate both the human form and the taller, more angular Varathian body. Gardens grew everywhere, filled with plants that had been brought from Earth and plants native to Karath that were beginning to flourish as the planet's atmosphere continued to heal. Kevin's wife, Angela, was working on a new project in the lower city. She was designing a memorial structure that would honor both the Varathians who had been lost to the plague 1,000 years ago and the humans who had helped save the civilization from extinction. Angela had become one of the most respected engineers on Karath, and her designs were known throughout the settlements for their beauty and functionality. She was pregnant with their first child, and Kevin felt a mixture of joy and nervousness whenever he thought about becoming a father on this alien world. Their 2 children from previous partners, adopted into their new family structure, were attending school in the city. The school system that had developed on Karath was unique. Human and Varathian children learned together side by side, each species understanding the other from the earliest ages. There was occasional friction and misunderstanding, but nothing that could not be resolved through communication and patience. The younger generation of both species seemed to understand instinctively that they were building something new together. However, not everything on Karath had remained peaceful. Deep within the sealed containment zone where the zombies had been trapped, something unexpected had begun to happen. The monitoring equipment that Marcus had insisted on installing showed unusual biological activity in the sealed chambers. The zombies were not dying. Instead, they were changing. Their bodies were undergoing a slow transformation at the cellular level. Lisa Park had theorized that without the constant drive to consume and spread the infection, the plague virus was entering a dormant state in many of the infected creatures. Some of them were actually beginning to show signs of healing. This discovery had sparked intense debate within the leadership council. Some Varathians wanted to maintain the seals forever, keeping the zombie population trapped until they eventually died out from natural causes. Others, particularly the younger generation of Varathians who had never known the plague firsthand, wanted to study the transformation more carefully. They asked whether it might be possible to eventually cure the infected and restore them to some semblance of normal consciousness. It was a moral question that had no easy answer. Kevin was asked to present his research and observations to the council. He had spent years studying the zombies, observing their behavior and documenting their transformation. In his presentation, Kevin explained that the infected creatures were not truly evil or irredeemable. They were victims of a biological weapon, creatures that had been twisted by forces beyond their control. He argued that if there was any possibility of restoring even a fraction of their consciousness, the moral obligation was to try. Some council members disagreed strongly with this position, but Kevin's passionate advocacy for the possibility of redemption seemed to influence many of the younger representatives. A new research project was approved, with strict safety protocols and careful monitoring. Lisa Park led the effort to understand the transformation happening in the sealed zombies. She worked with teams of both human and Varathian scientists, analyzing samples and running countless tests. After 6 months of intense research, Lisa made a stunning discovery. The zombies were not just healing. Some of them were developing the capacity for basic communication. Through a series of experiments with controlled frequency broadcasting, Lisa demonstrated that certain individuals in the zombie population could respond to stimulus and even express basic preferences. The implications were staggering. It meant that the creatures that everyone had assumed were irredeemably lost might actually have some capacity for consciousness, however primitive. It meant that they might be suffering from the plague in ways that nobody had fully understood before. Kevin found himself struggling with complex emotions. He had studied these creatures for so long, had understood them as animals following biological imperatives, but if they had even the smallest capacity for consciousness, then they were more than just mindless monsters. They were beings who had been trapped in their own bodies and minds, unable to communicate or express what they experienced. A small group of researchers, including Kevin and Lisa, began making careful contact with the most responsive individuals in the zombie population. They developed new frequency patterns that seemed to calm the infected creatures. They learned to identify specific zombies that showed more advanced responses to stimuli. Over time, a form of basic communication developed. The zombies could not speak words, but they could express simple concepts through response patterns to different frequencies. They seemed to understand that the researchers were trying to help them. The breakthrough came when one of the most responsive zombies managed to transmit what seemed to be a memory. Lisa monitored the frequency patterns and realized that the zombie was expressing something like an image, a memory from before the infection. The creature remembered what it had been like to be Varathian, to walk under the sun, to interact with others of its kind. The memory was fragmented and confused, but it was undeniably present. Lisa documented the experience, and when she presented her findings, there was silence in the council chamber. The zombies were not just biological machines. They were trapped beings, conscious on some level, suffering from their imprisonment in infected bodies. A proposal emerged from the research team. It was controversial, but it was impossible to ignore. Lisa suggested that with continued research and development of more advanced medical technology, it might be possible to develop a cure that could restore the infected creatures to some level of normalcy. It would be a massive undertaking that could take decades. Many of the infected were so degraded that they might never recover consciousness beyond their current primitive levels. But for others, particularly the younger ones who had been infected more recently, there might be hope. Kevin found himself on the forefront of a movement that had once seemed unthinkable. He advocated for the moral obligation to try to cure the zombies, to give them a chance at restoration and healing. Angela supported him completely, even as others in the community expressed fear and doubt. Marcus initially resisted the idea, concerned about security risks. But when Kevin showed him the research data and explained the ethical dimensions of the situation, Marcus agreed to work with the team to develop additional safety protocols. The city council voted on the proposal. After intense debate that lasted many hours, the vote passed by a narrow margin. A new research facility would be built specifically for the purpose of studying possible cures for the plague. Human and Varathian scientists would work together to understand the virus at the deepest biological level and develop treatments that might restore consciousness and health to the infected population. It would be a long, difficult project with no guarantee of success, but Kevin believed that it was the right thing to do. That evening, Kevin stood with Angela on the observation platform overlooking the city. The sky above Karath was now mostly clear, and the stars shone brilliantly. Angela leaned against Kevin, her hand on her pregnant belly, and asked if he thought they were making the right decision about the zombies. Kevin told her that he did not know for certain, but he said that part of being human, and part of what he had learned from working with the Varathians, was the willingness to hope that even the most damaged and broken beings could be healed. He said that if they gave up on the infected, they would be giving up on the possibility of redemption itself. Angela nodded slowly and kissed him gently. The future of Karath remained uncertain, but Kevin felt confident that they were moving in the right direction. The Varathian command vessel received the news with a combination of shock and wonder. The deep space sensors had detected the awakening of the ancient Ark ship, and the Varathian leaders understood immediately what it meant. A vessel from their civilization's most distant past had been buried on Karath for over 1,000 years, preserved in stasis beneath the earth. The humans had inadvertently awakened it. The Varathian leaders contacted the settlement with a message that changed everything. They wanted to send a formal delegation to meet with the human team and discuss what came next. The situation had grown far more complicated than a simple zombie elimination mission. Kevin stood with the rest of the team in the main conference area of the settlement when the Varathian delegation arrived. There were 5 of them, taller and more ornately detailed than the standard Varathian workers they had encountered so far. Their crystalline bodies seemed to shimmer with different colors, reflecting their status and role in Varathian society. The lead Varathian spoke directly into the minds of all the humans simultaneously. a voice that carried both authority and something that might have been gratitude. The Varathian leader explained that the buried ship was the Ark of Preservation, a vessel that had carried millions of Varathian colonists in stasis chambers before the plague had forced their civilization to abandon Karath. The Ark had been hidden and sealed by ancient protective systems, designed to survive indefinitely and preserve the sleeping Varathians until a time when the planet could be reclaimed. For 1,000 years, the Ark had waited in silence. Now it was awakening, and the Varathians had a proposal for the human team. The proposal was both incredible and impossible to refuse. The Varathians explained that the humans could choose one of two paths. They could take their promised rewards and leave Karath immediately, traveling to any world in the galaxy that they desired. They would be wealthy beyond imagination, and could live out their lives in comfort and luxury. Or they could stay and help the Varathians revive the frozen colonists and work together to rebuild Karath as a joint civilization. The choice would be difficult, the work would be hard, and it would take many years. But the Varathians believed that humanity and their species could create something unprecedented in galactic history. The human team asked for time to consider the proposal privately. In the common area of the settlement, the debate began immediately. Some people wanted to leave. They had done what they were asked to do, and they wanted to go home or find a new life somewhere else in the galaxy. Others were excited by the possibility of being part of something historic. Angela argued passionately that they could not abandon the Varathians now. They had started this mission together, and it would be wrong to leave them alone to face the challenges ahead. Marcus supported her position, saying that this was exactly the kind of opportunity that humans lived for, the chance to do something that mattered. Kevin listened to everyone speak, and then he shared his thoughts. He said that when he first arrived on Karath, he had been terrified and angry about being taken from Earth. But over the months of working with the team, he had learned something important. He had learned that humans were capable of amazing things when they worked together toward a goal that mattered. He had learned that understanding other beings, even beings as strange as the Varathians and the zombies they had encountered, was more powerful than simply fighting against them. He believed that staying and rebuilding Karath would give their lives a meaning that no amount of wealth or comfort could ever provide. By the end of his speech, most of the team agreed with him. Only 3 people chose to leave with the rewards the Varathians had promised. The revival of the frozen Varathians was an extraordinary undertaking. Lisa Park led a team of both humans and Varathians in carefully bringing the sleeping colonists back to consciousness. The process took weeks and required constant monitoring. Many of the frozen Varathians did not survive the revival process. Their bodies had been damaged by time and the stress of stasis, but thousands of them came back to life, confused and disoriented but alive. The Varathian leaders established a temporary government with both human and Varathian representatives. Marcus was asked to serve as the head of security and defense. Angela was given the responsibility of designing and planning the new city infrastructure that would accommodate both species. Lisa continued her biological research, now focused on understanding and documenting the history of the plague. Derek Chen, having fully recovered from his zombie scratch, managed the logistics of bringing supplies and materials from the Varathian vessels. Kevin's role evolved in unexpected ways. The Varathians asked him to lead a research project dedicated to understanding the ancient plague and the history of what had happened to Karath. This meant studying not only the biology of the plague but also the historical records and artifacts that the ancient Varathians had left behind. Kevin worked in the ancient vault laboratories, piecing together the story of a civilization that had faced unimaginable tragedy and had chosen to preserve hope by hiding their people in stasis. He became an expert on Karath's dark past, the first human to truly understand the complete history of this world. 5 years passed. The settlement on the plateau had grown into a small city. New buildings of both human and Varathian design rose from the earth. The energy barriers that had once been necessary for survival were no longer needed, as the zombie threat had been completely contained far beneath the surface. The sky above Karath had changed. The heavy clouds that had blocked the sun for centuries had begun to clear. Scientists working with both species had discovered that the pollution in Karath's atmosphere had been caused by the biological activity of the massive zombie population. With the zombies sealed away, the atmosphere was beginning to heal naturally. Kevin and Angela stood together on the high plateau where they had first arrived on Karath years ago. Angela was wearing a beautiful dress made from materials that combined human and Varathian design. Kevin wore clothes of similar construction. Around them, both humans and Varathians had gathered for a ceremony that would bind Kevin and Angela together in a way that honored both their species. The Varathians believed in commitment and partnership as deeply as humans did, and they had agreed to participate in a wedding that celebrated the union of two beings from different worlds. As the ceremony progressed, and Kevin and Angela exchanged promises to build a life together on this new world, Kevin looked out at the gathered crowd. He saw Marcus standing with his Varathian partner, a strong and graceful female named Kessera. He saw Lisa with Derek, both of them laughing at something one of the younger Varathian scientists had said. He saw all the humans and Varathians who had worked together to transform this dead world into something beautiful and full of possibility. The final moment of the ceremony arrived, and Kevin and Angela joined their hands together. The Varathian leaders sang a gentle melody that somehow translated into human language in their minds, a song of hope and new beginnings. Kevin felt tears running down his face as he looked at Angela. She was crying too, tears of happiness and fulfillment. The sky above them was clearer now than it had been in years. The sun was shining brightly, and in the distance, Kevin could see the first generation of children, born from the cooperation between humans and Varathians playing together on the green grass that was beginning to grow naturally on Karath's recovering landscape. Kevin thought back to the night. He had been abducted from his quiet life as a veterinarian on Earth. He thought about how afraid he had been, how overwhelming everything had seemed, but now he understood that his abduction had not taken anything from him. Instead, it had opened doors to possibilities he never could have imagined. He had found purpose, family, love, and the knowledge that his life was part of something infinitely larger than himself. Karath, the dead world that still had zombies, had become home, and as he looked at Angela and then at the beautiful sky above them, Kevin Harris knew that he had finally found where he was meant to be. The day of the activation arrived with perfect conditions. The sky above Karath was clear of the heavy clouds that usually hung over the planet, and visibility was excellent. Kevin stood in the central command center with Lisa, Marcus, and Angela, watching multiple screens that displayed real-time data from thousands of monitoring drones positioned throughout the valley system. Each drone was equipped with thermal imaging, motion sensors, and broadcasting equipment that would transmit the frequency patterns designed to trigger zombie migration. Angela checked her calculations one final time on the large display screen in front of her. The frequency sequence had been refined through dozens of simulations, but this was the first real test. She looked at Lisa, who gave her a nod of confidence. Lisa had spent the past week double-checking every aspect of the biological trigger mechanism. She was certain that the frequency would work. Marcus sat at his station, ready to manage the security systems and the defensive barriers that would guide the zombie movement exactly where they wanted it to go. Kevin's job was to monitor the behavioral responses of the infected creatures and communicate any unexpected developments to the rest of the team. His months of observation had given him an almost intuitive understanding of how the zombies moved and thought. He knew their patterns, their quirks, and their collective responses to environmental stimuli. He watched the thermal imaging from the drone feeds, seeing thousands of zombie signatures spread throughout the different zones of the valley system. Angela gave the signal to begin the broadcast. The frequency started at the lowest possible intensity, barely above the threshold needed to trigger a response in the infected creatures. For several minutes, nothing happened. Kevin felt a moment of doubt. What if Lisa's theory was wrong? What if the ancient biological research was incomplete or inaccurate? What if the frequency simply did not work on a population that had existed in isolation for so many centuries? Then the thermal signatures began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing coordination, the zombies started migrating toward the first frequency broadcast point. Kevin's voice was steady as he reported the movement to the team. The creatures were responding exactly as predicted. They moved in clusters, and the clusters merged together as they traveled toward the source of the signal. The first wave of infected reached the entry point of the funnel system within 30 minutes. Marcus activated the first energy barrier, channeling the zombies deeper into the valley. For the next 72 hours, the activation continued relentlessly. The team worked in shifts, maintaining constant vigilance and monitoring every aspect of the migration. The frequency broadcast points activated in sequence, creating a cascade effect that drew more and more zombies deeper into the valley system. The thermal imaging showed an incredible sight. What had been a scattered population of infected creatures spread across a vast area was now concentrated into a single, massive migration. It was like watching a river of heat signatures flowing downward through the valley toward the predetermined endpoint. Kevin marveled at the precision of Angela's design. Every barrier had been positioned exactly right. Every frequency broadcast point triggered movement at precisely the calculated moment. The zombies followed the cascade like water flowing downhill, unable to resist the biological imperative that drove them toward the source of the frequency signal. There were moments when the flow threatened to overwhelm the barriers, when the sheer number of infected creatures created a pressure that tested the energy walls to their limits, but the barriers held firm. On the second day, a problem developed in the lower valley sections. One of the frequency broadcast units malfunctioned, creating a dead zone where the frequency signal was too weak to be effective. A section of the zombie horde pooled in that area, confused and milling about without clear direction. The backup plan was activated immediately. Kyle took a team and descended into the valley to manually repair the broadcast unit. It was dangerous work, done in an armored suit with protective barriers keeping the zombies at a distance. The repair took 3 hours, but when it was complete, the frequency signal resumed and the confused zombie cluster resumed their migration downward. By the third day, the thermal imaging showed that the vast majority of the zombie population had been funneled to the lower sections of the valley. Thousands upon thousands of infected creatures clustered around the mouth of the massive sinkhole at the bottom of the valley. They moved restlessly, driven by the frequency signal that now emanated directly from within the sinkhole. Kevin watched in fascination as the creatures descended into the darkness, following the signal deeper and deeper into the earth. Angela moved to the final stage of the plan. The seismic charges that had been placed throughout the valley system during the preparation phase were armed. These were not ordinary explosives, but ancient Varathian devices designed to create controlled geological disruptions. Angela began the detonation sequence slowly, calculating the precise timing and intensity of each explosion to avoid triggering an uncontrolled chain reaction that could damage the plateau settlement. The first charge detonated, with a sound like the earth itself was groaning. The valley trembled, and on the thermal imaging, they could see the walls of the sinkhole beginning to collapse inward. The zombies below sensed the danger, but the frequency signal was now so strong that it overrode their survival instincts. They continued to move deeper into the darkness rather than attempt to escape. Angela continued the sequence, detonation after detonation, each one timed to ensure that more and more of the valley walls fell inward. By the final detonation, the massive sinkhole had collapsed completely, sealing itself with tons of rock and earth. The frequency signal had been cut off abruptly, and with it the behavioral trigger that had driven the zombies. The thermal imaging from the final moment showed the last of the infected creatures disappearing beneath layers of falling stone and dust. The team sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what they had just witnessed. Marcus was the first to speak. He reported that all barriers were secure and that no zombies had escaped the containment zone. The entire infected population of Kareth had been successfully trapped underground and sealed beneath tons of rock. The mission had worked exactly as planned. Lisa started to cry, tears of relief and accomplishment streaming down her face. Kyle and Sophie cheered from their positions at the observation posts. Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. Kevin continued to watch the thermal imaging displays, seeing the landscape gradually cool as the massive gathering of zombie heat signatures vanished. It was over. The threat that had seemed so overwhelming just days ago was now contained. The mission was not complete, but this was the crucial turning point. They had proven that human intelligence and cooperation could overcome even the most impossible obstacles. Then something unexpected appeared on the deepest sensing equipment. The seismic sensors that had been monitoring the subsurface of Karath were detecting movement deep below the sealed sinkhole. Not zombie movement, but something else entirely. Something large and metallic, shifting and slowly beginning to rise toward the surface. Kevin pointed to the readings and asked Angela what she thought it could be. Angela's face went pale as she studied the data. She said in a quiet voice that it looked like a ship. A massive ship, buried so deep that it had not registered on earlier scans. The activation of the seismic charges and the collapse of the sinkhole had apparently awakened something that had been dormant for 1,000 years. The Varathians on the command vessel would soon know that something extraordinary had happened. Everything was about to change again. 3 months had passed since the team arrived on Karath. The settlement had grown from a small outpost into something that resembled an actual base of operations. Kevin stood on the observation deck, looking out at the vast network of equipment and structures that had been built during those months. The team had worked tirelessly, driven by a mixture of survival instinct and the hope that if they succeeded, they would be rewarded and allowed to leave this dead world. The most important discovery came when Angela found the ancient vaults buried deep beneath the plateau. They were Varathian structures from centuries ago, sealed and preserved in perfect condition by advanced technology that still functioned despite the passage of time. Inside the first vault, they found detailed records of the biological weapon that had created the zombies. More importantly, they found working technology and biological research materials that the original scientists had stored before abandoning the planet. Lisa Park spent weeks in the vault laboratories,
analyzing the biological data left behind by the ancient Varathians.
What she discovered was crucial to their mission. The zombies were not mindless at all. Their bodies and brains had been transformed by the plague virus, but they retained certain patterns of thought. More specifically, Lisa found evidence that the virus created a specific kind of neural resonance. The infected creatures could communicate with each other through a frequency pattern that existed just beyond the range of normal hearing and sight. It was almost like a telepathic connection, but based on biological mechanisms rather than anything supernatural. Lisa made a breakthrough that changed everything. She found that the frequency pattern could be isolated and amplified. If the team could broadcast this frequency at precisely the right intensity, they could trigger a migration response in the infected. The zombies would move toward the source of the frequency, unable to resist the biological imperative that the plague had created. It was like discovering a command code for the entire zombie population. Angela took this information and began designing what she called the Funnel Project. She studied the landscape of Karath, looking for natural features that could be used to channel the zombie movement. On the map, she identified a vast valley system that descended into progressively lower elevations until it ended in a massive natural sinkhole. The valley looked like it had been carved by water or geological processes over millions of years, and it was perfectly suited for Angela's plan. They could position migration triggers throughout the valley, and the collective behavior of the zombies would cause them to follow the frequency cascade deeper and deeper into the valley until they reached the sinkhole. Then they could seal the opening and trap the entire infected population underground. Marcus worked on building the physical infrastructure needed to make the Funnel Project work. The team constructed barriers and channels throughout the valley. They installed energy barriers similar to the ones protecting the settlement, creating walls that the zombies could see and feel, but that would not harm them until the team activated the final stage of the plan. The work was exhausting and dangerous. During one of the construction missions in the 4th week, disaster struck. Derek Chen, the pilot who had been selected to manage the team's aircraft operations, suffered a terrible injury. A section of barrier scaffolding had been weakened by the corrosive atmosphere of Karath, and it collapsed on Derek while he was working in one of the deeper valley sections. He was pulled from the wreckage with a deep wound on his leg and his arm badly broken. Worse than the injuries themselves was the realization that his arm had come into contact with something infected. Someone had disturbed a zombie that had wandered into the work zone, and Derek had been scratched by one of the creature's claws before Kyle managed to kill the infected thing. Lisa worked frantically in the medical facility to treat Derek's injuries. The broken arm was relatively straightforward to set and immobilize, but the scratch from the zombie was terrifying. Lisa knew that even a small exposure to the plague virus could be catastrophic. She studied Derek's blood samples obsessively, looking for any signs that the infection had taken hold. For 3 days, Derek lay in the medical facility, burning with fever as his immune system fought against the virus. Kevin sat with him through those long nights, talking to him about Earth and home and all the things they had taken for granted before the Varathians had abducted them. On the 4th day, Lisa emerged from her laboratory with news that made everyone stop and hold their breath. She had synthesized a counter-agent using the biological research from the ancient vaults and her own knowledge of virology. The counter-agent was based on a specific antibody that existed naturally in human blood, but was rare and weak. Lisa had isolated it, cultivated it, and created a serum that could fight the plague virus. She administered the serum to Derek, and within 12 hours his fever began to drop. Within 2 days, Derek was sitting up and talking. Within a week, he was back to work. The success with Derek's treatment changed something fundamental in the team's confidence. They had proven that human ingenuity combined with scientific knowledge could overcome the threats of this world. The mood in the settlement shifted from despair and reluctance to something closer to determination. People began to believe that they could actually accomplish what the Varathians had asked them to do. Kevin continued his behavioral studies of the zombies, now with even more access to resources. He worked with Marcus to set up observation posts at various points around the valley system. From these posts, they watched the infected creatures' movement patterns, tracking how they responded to environmental changes and how their collective behavior evolved. Kevin noticed something remarkable. The zombies seemed to learn. When they encountered obstacles, they adapted their movements. When they found paths that led to other infected clusters, they seemed to communicate this information to others. Angela refined her designs based on all the new information coming from Kevin's observations and Lisa's biological research. She calculated exactly where to place each frequency broadcaster to create the most efficient migration cascade. Her engineering mind worked through thousands of calculations, testing different scenarios and configurations. She spent nights drawing diagrams and running simulations on the Varathian computers, making adjustments that would ensure the funnel project would work with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to the human team. The 3-month marker arrived with a sense of accomplishment, but also anxiety. The team was ready to begin the actual migration experiment. They would start small, triggering a movement in one of the smaller zombie clusters first to test their theory. Everyone understood that this was the moment where all their planning would either succeed or fail spectacularly. The entire mission depended on whether they could actually control the zombies' movement using the frequency broadcasting system. On the night before the first test, Kevin found Angela standing on the observation platform, looking out at the valley system in the darkness. He joined her there without saying anything. They stood together in silence for several minutes before Angela spoke. She said that she had been thinking about what would happen after they succeeded. What would they do if the plan actually worked? Would they go home, or would they stay and help rebuild this world? Kevin told her that he did not know. He said that a month ago, he would have chosen to go home immediately, but now, after seeing what the team had accomplished, after working with people like her and Marcus and Lisa, he was not sure anymore. Angela nodded slowly and said she felt the same way. The world had changed them, or maybe they had changed themselves. Either way, there was no going back to who they had been before. The landing was not as smooth as Kevin had expected. The ship jerked and shook as it descended through what the Varathians told them was Kareth's atmosphere. Kevin sat next to Lisa Park on a bench inside the transport vessel. They were strapped in with safety restraints that felt more like silk than metal. Around them, the other humans gripped their seats or each other, their faces showing various stages of fear and resignation. The journey from Earth had taken what felt like days, though the Varathians told them it was only a few hours. Time seemed to work differently in space. Through the transparent walls of the landing vessel, Kevin could see the world they were approaching. Kareth was a planet covered mostly in gray and brown tones. There were mountains in the distance that looked sharp and jagged, and vast plains that stretched endlessly toward a dark horizon. The sky above was not blue but a sickly greenish-gray color, as if the world itself was diseased. Heavy clouds hung over the landscape, blocking most of the sunlight. The sun itself, when Kevin could see it, was smaller and dimmer than Earth's sun, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. The ship touched down on a high plateau with a gentle bump that barely moved anyone. The Varathians appeared in the transport chamber through their transparent wall and indicated that the humans should unbuckle themselves and prepare to exit. Marcus stood up first, his military training making him act as if he had some kind of authority over the group. He told everyone to stay calm and follow instructions exactly. Kevin appreciated Marcus taking charge because it gave him something to think about, other than the overwhelming strangeness of everything happening around him. The exit ramp descended slowly, revealing the landscape of Kareth in full. The air that flooded into the chamber was cold and carried a smell like old metal and dust. Kevin took a deep breath and immediately regretted it. The air tasted wrong somehow, like it had been recycled too many times, but he stepped out onto the plateau anyway, his feet touching alien soil for the first time. The settlement the Varathians had prepared was impressive. There was a large central building made of materials that Kevin did not recognize, materials that seemed to shift between solid and slightly translucent depending on how the light hit them. Around the main building were smaller structures and what looked like defensive walls made of the same strange material. Beyond the walls, Kevin could see energy barriers shimmering in the air, creating a protective dome over the entire settlement. The Varathians explained that these barriers would keep out the undead creatures, at least for as long as the power generators continued to function. Inside the main building, the Varathians showed the humans to a large room that had been prepared as a briefing area. Maps of Kareth covered the walls, showing population density, terrain features, and most importantly, the locations of the zombie concentrations. The Varathians called them the afflicted in the humans' minds, but everyone understood they were talking about zombies. The red zones on the maps indicating highest zombie concentration covered almost 60% of Kareth's surface. The blue zones, where the Varathians believed the zombies had been weakened by time and biological degradation, covered most of the remaining land. Dr. Lisa Park stepped forward and asked to examine the biological samples the Varathians had collected from the infected creatures. The Varathians seemed pleased by this and led her to a laboratory where preserved specimens were stored. Kevin went with her, curious about what had created such a plague. The specimens were horrifying. Kevin could see that they had once been humanoid, with bones and tissues that resembled what he knew from his veterinary studies about anatomy, but something had changed them. Their bones were denser and thicker than any human skeleton should be. Their muscles had transformed into something that looked more like cables of metal than biological tissue. Their eyes, when still intact, were clouded over with a milky white film that suggested they could no longer see in any normal way. Lisa Park's scientific mind began working immediately. She started asking detailed questions about the biological weapon that had created these creatures. The Varathians explained that the weapon had been an ancient creation, something that had been developed during a war so long ago that even the Varathians' historical records were incomplete. The weapon had introduced a virus into the Varathian population that changed their cellular structure at the most fundamental level. It accelerated their metabolism, increased their strength, and removed their ability to feel pain, but it also removed their ability to think in any complex way. The infected became slaves to a single driving force, to consume and spread the infection to others. What Lisa discovered in the laboratory was shocking. She found evidence that the zombies had developed a kind of collective intelligence. Certain proteins in their systems seemed to create what she called quantum entanglement between individual infected creatures. This meant that when one zombie sensed something, others in its vicinity seemed to know about it instantly. They moved in coordinated patterns, not because they were individually intelligent, but because they shared a kind of hive mind. It was primitive compared to actual thinking, but it was far more sophisticated than simple undead aggression. Marcus gathered everyone in the common area that evening to discuss strategy. He suggested they begin with reconnaissance missions to the outer edges of the zombie zones, using the scanning equipment the Varathians had provided. Angela Rodriguez, the engineer, suggested they map out the terrain more carefully before committing to any aggressive actions. She proposed finding areas where the natural landscape could be used as a defense, places where they could use geography as a weapon against the infected. Kevin listened quietly but found himself thinking about the zombies differently than the others. His background with animals made him wonder if these creatures could be understood the way other animals could be understood. He asked Angela if she wanted to look at the movement patterns of the infected from a behavioral perspective. Angela's eyes lit up with interest. That night they spent hours studying the thermal imaging data that showed zombie movements across different regions. They noticed that the infected moved in specific patterns, avoiding certain areas and clustering around others. These patterns seemed to be driven by something other than random hunger. The next morning, Kevin and Angela prepared for their first venture outside the protective barriers. Marcus insisted on coming with them, bringing 2 other people from their group, a strong man named Kyle and a quick-thinking woman named Sophie. They traveled in a heavily armored vehicle that the Varathians had provided, moving slowly toward the outer edges of the blue zone, where zombie presence was supposed to be minimal. What they saw changed everything. The landscape beyond the settlement was a graveyard of forgotten history. Ruins of ancient Varathian cities stood like monuments to a dead civilization. The structures were beautiful and geometrically perfect even in their decay, but more importantly, they could see zombies moving in the distance. From their armored vehicle, the team observed the creatures without being detected. The infected moved with an eerie grace, not shambling or stumbling but moving with a controlled precision that seemed to suggest intelligence. Angela pointed out that the infected avoided certain areas completely. She marked these on their maps as dead zones. The creatures seemed to know not to go there, as if something repelled them. Kevin watched through binoculars and noticed something else. The zombies moved in response to environmental triggers. When birds flew overhead, they looked up in unison. When the wind changed direction, they paused and seemed to smell the air. They were not mindlessly aggressive. They were responding to stimuli in a way that suggested some form of collective awareness. As the sun set on Karath, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the team returned to the settlement. Kevin realized that understanding these creatures might be more important than simply fighting them. Angela agreed with him. She said that if they could understand how the infected thought and what drove them, they could predict their movements and use that knowledge against them. Marcus was skeptical, but he acknowledged that they needed more information before they committed to any large-scale action. Kevin Harris checked the temperature gauge on the animal shelter's main room one more time before locking up for the night. The evening was quiet, with only the soft sounds of dogs breathing and cats moving in the darkness. He had been working as a veterinarian for 10 years, and he loved this job more than anything else. Helping animals made him feel like his life had real meaning. He turned off the last light and walked toward the back exit, his keys jingling in his pocket. The sky outside was clear and full of stars. Kevin stood for a moment, looking up at the universe and wondering if anyone else was out there looking back. He had always been fascinated by the possibility of life beyond Earth. His friends thought he was strange for reading so many books about space exploration, but Kevin did not care what they thought. The world was too big and full of mysteries to ignore. As he walked to his car, Kevin felt something change in the air. It became cold, colder than it should have been in the middle of the night. He looked around but saw nothing unusual. The parking lot was empty, and the shelter building sat alone on the edge of the small town. Kevin shrugged and continued walking. He was probably just tired. He had worked a double shift that day, helping a wounded deer and treating several dogs for injuries. Then the sky lit up with a bright blue light that hurt Kevin's eyes. He covered his face with his hands and fell to his knees. The light was not coming from the sky above him, but from something descending toward the earth. Kevin forced himself to look through his fingers, and what he saw made his heart freeze in his chest. A massive ship was hovering directly above the animal shelter, blocking out half the sky. It was impossible. It could not be real. The ship was enormous, easily the size of 3 or 4 buildings put together. Its surface was smooth and metallic, reflecting the blue light that seemed to come from inside the vessel itself. There were no visible weapons or doors that Kevin could see, just a smooth, perfect surface that looked like it was made from a single piece of metal. The ship descended lower and lower, moving slowly and deliberately toward the ground. Kevin tried to run, but his legs would not obey. It was as if his body had been frozen by fear. He watched helplessly as the ship continued to move closer to him. The light from the vessel grew brighter, and Kevin could feel heat radiating from it, even though it was still hundreds of feet away from him. He wanted to scream, but his voice would not work. A beam of light shot down from the ship and surrounded Kevin completely. He felt his body being lifted off the ground. His feet left the earth, and he began to rise into the air. The acceleration was smooth and controlled, but Kevin felt his stomach turning inside out. He was going up, being pulled toward the ship, toward something completely unknown. His mind raced with thoughts of dying, of being taken apart by aliens, of never seeing his family again. The light stopped his upward movement when he was just below the ship's opening. A section of the metal hull that Kevin had thought was solid suddenly became transparent, and he could see inside. There was a large chamber with white walls and a smooth floor. The light that had been holding Kevin moved him forward and down through the opening in the hull. He fell gently onto the floor of the chamber, gasping for breath. The opening sealed behind him with a sound like air escaping from a bottle. Kevin stood up on shaky legs and looked around. He was not alone. There were other humans in the chamber with him. A woman with dark hair stood near the far wall, her face pale with fear. 2 men stood near a smaller door, whispering to each other. 3 more people sat on the floor, looking dazed and confused. There was a young man who looked like he might be a college student, an older woman in business clothes, and another man who was clearly terrified. Kevin counted the people as his mind slowly started working again. There were 13 humans total in the chamber, including himself. They must have all been taken from different places. He recognized none of them. The woman with dark hair looked at Kevin and asked in a shaky voice where he was from. Kevin told her he was from Colorado, from a small town outside Denver. She said her name was Lisa Park, and that she had been taken from her apartment in San Francisco. She was a scientist, she said. She worked with viruses and bacteria. A man with strong shoulders and military-looking posture spoke up and said his name was Marcus Thompson. He was a former soldier, he said, and he could tell they were on some kind of spacecraft. He advised everyone to stay calm and observe everything around them. The other people introduced themselves one by one. There was Angela Rodriguez, an engineer who had been taking a late-night walk when the light appeared. Derek Chen was a pilot who had been cleaning his small airplane at a private airfield. The others were students, workers, and people from all different backgrounds and ages. Before anyone could ask more questions, a section of the wall began to glow. The white surface became transparent, and Kevin saw something that made him forget to breathe. On the other side of the transparent wall were beings that were definitely not human. They were tall, almost 7 feet in height, and their bodies seemed to be made of something like crystal or glass. Light refracted through their forms, creating rainbow patterns across their skin. Their faces were smooth and geometric, with large eyes that glowed with a soft white light. They had no mouths that Kevin could see, but somehow they communicated anyway. Kevin heard words appearing in his mind, not through his ears but directly in his thoughts. The voice was calm and strange, like listening to wind moving through empty spaces. The voice explained that Kevin and the other humans had been selected for a mission of great importance. The being said they were the Varathians and they came from a world called Kareth. That world had once been beautiful and filled with life. But many centuries ago, a terrible weapon had been used on their planet. The weapon had turned many of the Varathians into creatures that did not die but could not truly live either. The planet had been abandoned, but now the time had come to reclaim it. The Varathians said they had studied human genetics and human behavior. They believed that humans possessed qualities that could help with this mission. Humans were adaptable, creative, and surprisingly resilient. More importantly, human biology showed a natural resistance to the plague that had created the undead creatures. The Varathians needed humans to go to Kareth and help clear the planet of the zombie threat. In exchange, the humans would be rewarded with wealth beyond imagination and knowledge that would allow them to live comfortable lives anywhere in the galaxy. Kevin felt cold fear running through his body. Zombies. That was not a word he wanted to hear. The other humans began to panic, speaking all at once, asking questions and demanding to be returned to Earth. But the Varathian's voice simply continued in Kevin's mind, explaining that Earth was millions of miles away and they would not be going back. The choice was simple: cooperate with the mission and be rewarded, or refuse and face an uncertain future. The Varathians seemed completely certain that humans would eventually agree. They had studied humanity for many generations, and they knew that humans could be persuaded by promises of wealth and the promise of becoming legendary heroes. Kevin looked at the other humans, seeing his own fear reflected in their eyes. He knew that his life had just changed completely. There was no going back to his quiet job at the animal shelter, no more nights looking at the stars and wondering about alien life. He was living that reality now, whether he wanted to or not.